All right, hey everyone. Welcome to the third and final part of this three-part series, Intro to Design. Today we're going to be talking about defining success. Um, for another reminder, my name is McKay Adams, product design manager at Jack Henry. Over the last 5 or 6 years, I've been in the fintech space, had the opportunity to work with these organizations in a research capacity, and that has been tremendously influential, especially in the part that we're going to talk about today. So stay tuned for that. I do have 16 plus years experience in the design field. Started out as a graphic designer, worked with large companies, small companies, agencies, a really big variety of teams and products, all of which has influenced my perspective on design. And that's what this whole series is about, is sharing my perspective. So take it with a grain of salt. All right. We've talked about the design process in the first series, theoretically how it's supposed to work. The second series, we talked about design in practice, what it's like in the real world. Today, we're going to cover some things to help you reconcile the two and find success in your career. Let's get started. All right. I mentioned this in the last one really briefly. I introduced Don Norman and his famous quote, "Everything is a system." But I attended a webinar where he added to that and said, "and can therefore be designed." So that's the silver lining here. Part two, we talked a lot about how the different systems that you work in influence what you can or can't do as a designer. The good news is they can be influenced, they can be designed. Jared Spool mentions this as well. If you want to improve the user experience of your org or the design or anything in your org, you'll need to change the optimizations of your organization. This is the core of a UX strategy. Great business models are designed. All right, so how do we go about doing that? I want to tell you a quick story. This is actually an experience I had with a startup. And this will highlight some of the keys that we talk about at the end. So I worked for a startup called Acima that would do small leases to individuals with zero credit or poor credit. And we worked with merchants. We had merchant partners for this. Most of our merchants were automobile shops or furniture stores. So a customer with zero credit or poor credit would come in, they need a repair or they needed a home appliance of some kind and didn't have the cash for it. They could apply for a lease from us, and then by submitting an application, we would review that, make a decision, send it back to the merchant, and more often than not, we were able to give them a lease for that necessity, repair or appliance. So that was the basic business model. Well, one day I came into work and my product manager came over. He pulled up the online application form, which I've replicated here, and he said, "We need to make this faster. We need to do whatever we can to make these leases go through more quickly. They're taking too long." And I said, "Well, what about this section here? Can we get rid of that or this field?" And he said, "No, we can't get rid of anything. I think we were able to remove one field. Everything else was required in order to run our proprietary decision engine, which is a very complicated logical algorithm that analyzed risk for each candidate and determined if we should lend to them and how much. So we couldn't get rid of anything." Well, I stared at the screen for quite a while, trying to figure out how am I going to make this go faster if I can't get rid of any of these fields. So I decided to take a step back, try and understand the problem, and do some observation. So what I did, you can see here on the right, we actually had some analytics on the different steps of the lease process. And so I worked with the business analyst helped me pull the analytics. We broke down how long each lease took in each stage and charted that out. I also sat with the processors. We had processors in the office that would check the leases, double check them, do different things. There's about 3 or 4 departments of processors that did different things. I sat with each one of them and watched them work through leases. I watched a handful of leases go through from start to finish, and all of this took about a couple weeks. And what I found was really interesting. This was a startup. They'd only been around a couple years, and they'd grown a lot. And so, in the course of growing, I think this was just a result of some growing pains. There was a protocol that when a lease in a particular status went to this department of processors, they were instructed to send it to this department of processors to double check. Well, that ended up happening a couple times because this department had a protocol when that happened to send it to this department. And so it became a game of tag and pass the buck. That happened several times until it ultimately came back to the original department and they approved it anyway. And so at this point, our decision engine had had 2 years of fine tuning and had become very reliable. In fact, it was almost 100%. It was like in the 90 percentile of correct decisions almost every time. So we had a tremendous amount of confidence in it. So some of these protocols had been around since the beginning when we were still double checking the decision engine to make sure that it was doing the correct thing. So what I realized was we could eliminate this department altogether, and that would solve the problem of these particular leases and this status, but also speed up a few other leases. So we would probably have an increase in performance across the board if we just got rid of this department. So I sent an email to the product manager with my findings, and he was as shocked as I was. He came over, we went over it together, and he was like, you know what? I think you're right. So he presented that to the CEO and founder of the company, who it was a small startup, so he was there and he was eager or willing to take risks, try new things, and he said, "Okay, let's do it." I was happy that we were able to move this team of about 6 or 7 processors onto other teams in the company, so they didn't lose their job. I felt a little weird about them potentially losing the job. Thankfully, that didn't happen. Well, about 6 months went by, and we checked the data again, and we saw an improvement. So here, the light blue on the far left side is leases that take 0 to 1 days to complete. So at the beginning of this, we were around 20%, 21%. We implemented this change in November. You can see already in December that increased by 5%. And by May that year, that was an increase of 14% from September, and about 13% from here. So really good improvement. You'll notice here on the other end, there's another light blue that's 40 plus days, and we had about 3%, looks like, in September, and that number went down. And in May, there were no leases that took more than 40 days. And so it worked. We got what we wanted. More importantly, or maybe not more importantly, but in addition, the CEO really got something they wanted, which was we decreased our cost per lease by almost 50%. So because of all this, we knew exactly how much it cost us to run a lease, and that over that span dropped almost in half. And which, if you know CEOs, that makes them very happy. So ultimately, what we had was a win-win situation. Everyone got what they wanted, and I didn't design a single pixel for this solution. I did do the observation and research, come up with a plan, but it didn't require any like classical or standard design deliverables. So there's some lessons here. We'll dive into those. First of all, the key is understanding value and the exchange of value. So what do I mean by that? Well, Jim Callback tells us businesses exist to create value, value as perceived by the customers and satisfy needs, and value for the company by staying profitable. So there's the mission of a business, is to create value towards the customers and towards itself. So design and business both want to render valuable solutions to satisfy human needs. What this looks like, I got a slide messed up, but so what this looks like is a balanced triangle. So we have what's called viability, feasibility, and desirability. In this case, I've changed desirability to match our definition of utility. Very similar concept, but it's not only, and the business is not only concerned in answering can it make money and can it be built, but a third leg or third area would be, does anyone want it? Remember our cycle, circular flow of money. Number one reason businesses fail is no market demand. Nobody's buying it. So there's a crucial aspect is determining, is this going to satisfy the want or need? Tim Brown recognized this in his book. A competent designer will resolve each of these three constraints: feasibility, viability, desirability, or utility. But a design thinker will bring them into a harmonious balance. That was the highest compliment an IDEO person could give anybody, would be to be a design thinker. And that's what he's talking about, bringing those three into a harmonious balance, a win-win-win situation. Much more difficult than a simple design solution for a customer. That's because, as Erica Hall pointed out, the business model or the underlying exchange of value is the new design grid. Now, this is a reference to graphic design. Back in the day, layouts were all snapped to the grid, right? You had 12-column grid or different grids, and all the elements on a layout or page snap to the grid to make it a harmonious layout. Well, today's world, the solutions snap to the business. If it doesn't work for the business, it gets rejected out of hand. It doesn't fit, right? So we need to understand that exchange of value. What is valuable to the business in order to make sure that we design solutions that fit to that new grid. As Marty Kagan said, successful products are not only loved by your customers, but they work for your business. That's the exchange of value. Okay, that's the first thing we need to understand. Second thing, how do we do that? How do we know what is valuable? How do we know if we've done it? How do we know if we've been successful? Well, this is where behavior comes in. And this is the key. Jeff Gothelf wrote, meaningful changes in customer behavior, i.e. outcomes, are the only way to know if we've delivered value. All right. Your success as a designer is measured by the value you create for your business and customers. The only way to determine value is by measuring changes in behavior. So what does that mean? An example, we wanted to speed up leases, right? What does that mean? More leases coming through, getting approved quickly. So the change of behavior there is faster leases, more leases, and we were able to demonstrate that. Another popular one is we need more signups. What is that? What's the behavior there? More people physically going, signing up. How many do we have before? How many do we have now? Did it increase? Yeah, and that's a good indication of if value has been increased as well. Or sales. We need to sell more of X item. Well, this is what sales were before. What were sales after we designed a change? Did it change the behavior? I would submit that everything designers are doing is an effort to change a behavior. Even a poster, printed out poster, flyer, poster on the wall. What are you trying to do? You're trying to get somebody to that event, or you're trying to, whatever that flyer says is trying to influence a behavior of some kind. So when you look at it that way, then you come to the same conclusion that Robert Fabricant came to when he said the medium of designers is behavior. So it's not pixels, it's not fancy designs, colors, typography, all of that. We're trying to influence behavior, move people in different ways, which makes sense because Jacob Nielsen also said UX is people, user experience is about people. Behaviors, what are people doing? Helping them achieve what they're trying to achieve. So it's not about tasks and deliverables. A successful designer is not the one that cranks out the most prototypes or the most designs or does the most output. A successful designer is the one that creates the outcomes that pushes the needle in the behavior in the direction that is intended, that works for the business, also works for the customer. All right. The last thing we need to talk about, or I would mention, is adding a dash of science or evidence to help your case. Amy Butcher said that. She said this essentially: if your product are intended to change people's behavior, then psychology is essential for your design toolkit. Even if they're not, a strategic dash of science will help you create better products. I would argue that as a designer, almost everything you're doing or working on is intended to change a behavior in one way or another. Some behaviors are harder than others. And for those hard behaviors, like fitness, finance, well-being, require more psychology than others because people are not rational, right? There's a lot of factors and contexts that go into decision making that we need to be aware of and explore. Well, speaking of science, adding a dash of science, science has its own model for developing new findings. The scientific method: observe, question, research, hypothesize, experiment, analyze, conclude. Now, some of this may look familiar to our own model: observe, observation, research. We've talked about research, experimenting or exploring. So there is actually a fair amount of overlap, I would argue, between the scientific method and the design process, with some key distinctions we'll talk about in a second. Kristen Berman, behavioral researcher, said for product managers, designers, and researchers, behavioral science is a shortcut to building successful solutions. It unlocks the psychology behind why our customers act or don't act and gives us the roadmap on what to build and test. Remember this circular flow of money? A critical part of this is building something that people actually want in order to stay alive. Well, sometimes businesses are straight out lucky and they get it right. They find something that consumers actually want and it's released in the right time and does really well. A lot of times it takes some effort to uncover that and get it right. And that's where some psychology can help. As Julie O'Brien said, behavioral design marries what the academic world knows about human behavior and, importantly, how to study human behavior with what the design world knows about empathy and innovation. It builds on design thinking in three important ways. It builds a more systematic approach to solution design. It provides evidence-based theories for understanding user behavior. And 3, it offers quantitative research methods that enable teams to understand causality during the design process. So we can use theories and existing knowledge developed from the scientific method to help inform solutions, which is what Ruth Schmidt talks a lot about in her paper, Strange Bedfellows. Rather than applying known principles to known problems in search of best fit solutions, a design lens allows us to use generalized criteria that can help shape heretofore unknown solutions. What she goes into a little bit more in depth, and what I cover in another series, is kind of the difference between deductive, inductive, and abductive reasoning. Now, the scientific method is a purely deductive method. And the goal there is absolute truth, right? Take a big principle, tweak one minor thing, test it until you have something that is going to be always false or always true. And it becomes, a known fact or a well-regarded fact. Inductive and abductive are a little bit different. I would say that a design process more often than not ends up looking like an abductive reasoning. So you take partial observations and context together and you make the most probable solution, right? It's not absolute truth, but it's a probable solution, right? And so that's what we can do. It's different than academic science. Coming up with solutions that's part of the creativity, part of the innovation. Taking what we know, what already exists, combining into new solutions, new potential solutions that are the most probable. Now, this is important. As you try and instill all this change, it's important to have the evidence and test assumptions. Make sure that you're on the right track by having this strategic dash of science. And once you're sure, having evidence that you can share that supports the probable solution and get internal buy-in among your teams. So the 3 things I would encourage all designers in order to find success in your career. First, seek to understand the value inside, that's internally and externally. what is valuable to your business, what is valuable to the stakeholders in your organization. Understand that really well. In addition to what do your customers value. So it's double the work. It's applying the design process externally on customers to understand their wants and needs, in addition to internally in your own organization to understand the wants, needs, and value of your organization, and finding the win-win solution that satisfies both. I've just at least doubled your work, but it's necessary. Second thing, seek to change behaviors. Once you understand those values internally and externally, now you need to find ways to change the outcomes, change the behaviors, is also internally and externally. People aren't signing up. Well, you need to find a way to increase signups and change that behavior, which goes with the third thing, using a dash of science. You need to have the evidence. Well, first of all, you need to be measuring everything. That's step one. Make sure you're measuring what you're trying to change, and then provide evidence that, signups were X, we applied Y design, and now signups are Z. And having that evidence to test assumptions and understand causality, what really influenced that change. And so using a dash of science, understanding systematic observation, research methods, and being able to communicate those will help you kind of influence those behaviors. So that's a really quick overview. I'm going to try and go more in depth in all of this in another series that I call the 4 virtues of design, which are utility, clarity, harmony, and causality. Hopefully we're able to dive into those in more depth. So stay tuned for that series. But that is all I had for this part, for this series, Intro to Design. Again, this is based on my perspective, my experience, but hopefully it gives you an insight into what it's like to work as a designer, and possibly new frame of reference and a new definition of what success might look like for you. Let me know what you think in the comments. Feel free to message me, ask questions, and thanks for watching.